begin the 1920s and 30s, the roaring 20s and the depressing 30s. As soldiers returned from war and settled down to return to normalcy, as many put it, the U.S. entered an age of dramatic social and political change. For the first time, more Americans lived in cities than on farms. The nation's total wealth more than doubled during the decade, and this economic growth swept many Americans into an affluent but unfamiliar consumer society. People from coast to coast could buy the same goods thanks to nationwide advertising and the spread of chain stores. They listened to the same music, did the same dances, and even used the same slang. Many Americans, though, were uncomfortable with this new urban and sometimes racy mass culture. In fact, for many, even most people in the United States, the 1920s brought more conflict than celebration, and many feared that radicalism was sweeping the nation. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had sparked paranoia that communism was spreading to the United States. A communist party had actually formed here, although it only had about 70,000 members. World War I anti-German hatred then transferred to many other foreign groups. And they believed that these foreigners, these radicals, were responsible for the large number of strikes that were occurring in the aftermath of World War I. There were more than 4 million workers participating in various strike activities. There was actually more strikes in 1917, but the number of strikers was far more in 1919. Corporate leaders refused to make concessions, and they felt that labor needed to continue to do their part. But millions of returning veterans were furious about the economic situation at home. These labor interests felt that they had sacrificed during the war, and they now expected payback. In January of 1919, perhaps the most famous general strike in U.S. history occurred in Seattle, when more than 35,000 shipyard workers went on strike after they failed to get wage increases to compensate for inflation during the war. All of the unions in Seattle backed the shipyard workers. Although the strike was peaceful and orderly, conservatives feared a European-style labor takeover. In September of that same year, the Boston police strike resulted in over 70% of Boston's 1,500 policemen going on strike to seek wage increases and the right to unionize. Governor Calvin Coolidge called out the National Guard, stating that there was no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. This would prove to be the most frightening strike in the minds of many Americans. Most of the police, though, were fired, and a new force was recruited from amongst the National Guard. And just a couple of months later, in November of 1919, the United Mine Workers of America, under John Lewis, also went on strike, seeking shorter hours and higher wages. Many Americans believed that these labor troubles were the results of Bolshevism and blamed the radical influences for these strikes. After several bomb scares associated with some of the strikes, Attorney General A. Mitchell Parmel got permission from Congress to, quote, tear out the radical seeds that have entangled American ideas and their poisonous theories, unquote. He deported 249 radicals to Russia alone, mostly anarchists, after conducting numerous raids. In January of 1920, more than 5,000 suspected communists were arrested in a 33-city nationwide dragnet. Most Americans condoned Palmer's actions, but some began to question the compromising of individual rights. This so-called Red Scare ultimately came to an end in the summer of 1920, when the alleged May Day strikes never occurred. But conservative businessmen used the Red Scare to raise up anti-union thought and to break the backs of many fledgling unions. Perhaps nowhere is radicalism more evident than in the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were charged and convicted of killing 2 people in a robbery in South Braintree, Massachusetts. The judge and jury were likely very prejudiced against them because the defendants were Italian, atheists, anarchists, and draft dodgers, all of which was brought up by the prosecution at the trial, along with their supposed radicalism. They were convicted and sentenced to death, and despite repeated requests for a new trial, one was not given, and they were executed in 1927. Riots broke out after their execution in cities around the world because the powers that convicted them were members of the upper class. Therefore, the execution seemed to be class-based. In the South, radicalism came in the form of a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. But it wasn't just limited to the South. It also spread heavily into the Southwest and the north-central states of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. More than 40% of new membership was located in just those three states. Part of the resurgence was likely spawned by the 1915 film Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith, which glorified the Klan and Klan membership, even linking it to the founding of America. But this Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s more resembled the nativist Know-Nothing Party of the 1840s rather than the anti-Black terrorist organization of the 1860s, or even the one that would appear later in the 1950s and 60s. Although boasting millions of members by the mid-1920s, embezzlement of funds by Klan officials led to congressional investigation and its eventual decline. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan, though, were able to gain a foothold outside of the old Confederacy because many in America, especially in rural areas, believed that immigrants were contributing to an eroding of old-fashioned American values, whatever that meant. Congress ultimately is going to stop immigration, or at least significantly slow it down, by passing the Immigration Act of 1921, also known as the Emergency Quota Act or the Johnson Quota Act. This law ended open immigration and imposed an annual limit and a quota system. No more than 350,000 people total could come to the United States per year, and no more than 3% of a nation's nationals already in the United States could come from a country each year. The act clearly favored old immigrants over new immigrants. 3 years later, Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Act, or the Immigration Act of 1924, which included subdivisions known as the National Origins Act and the Asian Exclusion Act. This law would further reduce immigration to just over 150,000 total people per year, and reduce the 3% number down to 2%, and change the census on which that number was based from 1910 back to 1890, very much favoring old immigrants over new immigrants. People of Asian descent were banned completely, although Canadians and Latin Americans would be exempted from the quota system, as long as they were native-born. Southern and Eastern Europe would be the most affected. The numbers you see here on these quotas was from the first immigration law, not from the second. One of the last progressive reforms to be enacted that carried into the 1920s was Prohibition, which went into effect when the 18th Amendment was finally ratified and went into effect at the beginning of 1919. The Volstead Act would provide for the implementation of the amendment, and it labeled as an intoxicating beverage any beverage that contained more than 0.5% of alcohol. But there were significant problems with enforcement. Federal authorities could really never satisfactorily enforce a law where the majority of a people, or at least a strong minority, were hostile to it. There was also a significant lack of officials to enforce it, and there were still multiple ways around the law. Alcohol could be sold by a doctor's prescription, and it was still necessary for numerous industrial uses, although poison was supposed to be added to it to prevent consumption. Another challenge is that alcohol could be manufactured in small quantities almost anywhere, and it was legal in Canada and could be imported into the United States through secret back roads, secret compartments in vehicles, or boats that arrived in the middle of the night along the Great Lakes. And in many places, particularly in large cities, Supposedly secret bars operated by bootleggers popped up all over town. These clubs often operated in great secrecy, requiring passwords to be spoken to gain admittance. That's why they were called speakeasies. A few of the photographs on this slide are from speakeasies. And by the way, did you catch the mistake? Look closely. Many Americans became used to casually breaking the law, and in some areas of the country, alcohol consumption actually increased during Prohibition. The experiment might have worked had beer and wine been allowed. Ultimately, though, Prohibition would end in 1933, more than 13 years after it went into effect. Another result of the Prohibition movement, though, was the rise of organized crime, as huge profits could be made from bootlegging. It became a foundation for corruption, and there was a tremendous increase in gang violence related to organized crime. For example, in just the city of Chicago, more than 500 gang members were killed during the late 1920s. And Al Capone was believed responsible for many of those deaths, as he was one of the most powerful gangsters of the decade. Another powerful individual was John Dillinger. Many government officials would accept bribes to not enforce Prohibition, and organized crime eventually spread into other related areas, such as gambling, prostitution, and narcotics by 1930. And it was also only enforced at the federal level, leaving many police chiefs and city council members and even mayors to flaunt the law and even have secret stashes of alcohol for themselves. The illegal alcohol industry was so profitable that it was estimated that the annual take of the underworld was between 12 and $18 billion. The 1920s saw a challenge between modernism and traditional values. In 1924, the state of Tennessee passed a law banning the teaching of any theories that contradicted the divine creation of man, as was taught in the Bible. The ACLU wanted to fight the case and ran an advertisement asking for a teacher to volunteer to be arrested for violating the law, so they could then challenge the legality of that law. High school biology teacher John Scopes obliged and was indicted for teaching evolution in violation of state law. The case attracted a huge public following and was nicknamed the Monkey Trial. Noted attorney Clarence Darrow served as Scopes' defense attorney, and William Jennings Bryan, a Presbyterian fundamentalist and former presidential candidate, served as the prosecutor. Fundamentalism itself seemed to be on trial in this trial of the century. But ultimately, fundamentalism won when John Scopes was found guilty of violating the law and fined $100. But this trial of the century seems to also have negatively affected fundamentalism. Gradually, though it remained illegal in many places, the teaching of evolution and modern scientific theories became commonplace in classrooms across the nation. Part of the reason for the attack on modernism, as evidenced by that trial of evolution, was that small town and rural America felt that the rapid progress in consumerism of the 1920s decade was threatening American culture and values. During the 1920s, businesses had seen tremendous growth with a rapid progress in the development of consumerism. The United States was becoming a mass consumption economy, and business was almost treated as a religion. Calvin Coolidge, who became president when Warren Harding died in 1923, professed, "The man who builds a factory builds a temple." It was really considered the businessmen that ruled the nation, rather than the politicians. But the new technologies that came about in the 1920s brought all kinds of consumer products into the American home. And Americans could shop at the same stores, no matter where they lived, thanks to the development of chain stores. For example, there were 324 Sears Roebuck stores nationwide by 1930. And up until 1924, they had been exclusively a catalog business with 0 stores. And just for comparison, in 2017, there was 594 Sears stores, down from a peak of about 3,500. Businesses would introduce assembly line production as a means of improving the efficiency of their production and maximize their profits. This idea of the assembly line is really an outgrowth of the concept of interchangeable parts and had been around in various conceptual stages since the early 1800s, thanks to Eli Whitney. First introduced into the auto industry by Ransom Olds, the maker of the Oldsmobile, who patented the process, the concept would truly be perfected by Henry Ford when he installed a moving assembly line that significantly sped up the overall process. The product would move, not the worker. By the end of the decade, most manufacturers in the United States had adopted that technique. Here's just a sampling of some of the more popular goods made available to the public in the 1920s. Everything from a vacuum cleaner and a telephone, to a combination coffee pot and toaster, a washing machine, a stove, a refrigerator, a waffle iron, a popcorn maker, even a toaster. Of course, notice virtually all of these are electric, something that rural areas did not necessarily have access to. All of the production of these goods also required energy, both to manufacture as well as to transport to their destinations. While coal still dominated the railroad and home heating industries, oil would quickly be in high demand for both automobiles and electrical production. In the 1920s, new oil fields were discovered across Southern California. Huntington Beach in 1920, Long Beach and Santa Fe Springs in 1921, Dominguez, that is Carson, in 1923, and even Inglewood in 1924. Southern California became the hotbed for oil production in the United States. In a 1926 Times Magazine article, it was said that the Standard Oil Company of California is the largest individual producer of crude oil in the U.S. and dominates the marketing of petroleum products along the west coast of both Americas. During the same period, California's agriculture and manufacturing markets also expanded rapidly, and the increased oil production helped to power the development of these industries. However, the development of increased oil production in California, plus those in Texas, had serious consequences. There would be a surplus of oil reaching the market, which impacted the price of the commodity. With the accelerated oil drillings, the price of oil over the decade fell from $28 a barrel to less than $10 a barrel. Now, this was good for industries that used oil, but not so good for the oil industry itself.